So good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, is the case for Y, who's our next presenter. Welcome back to the security stream. If you don't know me, I'm Jamie Pease. I'm the chairman of the security working group for GSE UK. And it gives me pleasure to welcome back Y Choi from IBM Poughkeepsie. And if you read the synopsis for Y's session today, and also you heard my announcements earlier in the week, Y did a presentation for us at the conference last November, and kind of one of the prereqs really for today was that you heard that session either last year or you listened to the replay. So welcome back, Y. Y's got a little quiz for you at towards the end of her presentation. And once the answers, so what you should do is try and get the answer, write down the answer before you see it. And then what I would like you to do is actually post how many of those questions you got right in the chat. So, and it's just for fun, it's just a bit of fun. So if you could do that, that would be great. Of course, I'm exempting myself because you know how useless I am, Why, at these things. But, but anyway, if you've got any questions, folks, do please pop them in the chat and we'll read those out towards the end of the session. But without further ado, Y, it's over to you. Welcome back.
Thank you, Jamie. So we want to have some, if you have some questions, we will answer them all at the end. When you post the question, maybe you put the slide number. If you have a question specific to that slide number, just put down the number and then the question, so we can go back specifically to what the question is about. So let's get started. And thank you, Jamie, for the introduction. And I think if you participate in last year's conference, it is the story part 2. So hopefully you will find it useful, and hope you get your part 1 find it useful, and you actually practice the server authentication without any problem. All right, let's get started with part 2. The title of this session is What Keyring? What Certificates? All I know is TLS works only in server authentication. If you attended my session last year, you may find the title sounds familiar. Here is the agenda. First of all, we will review of what we learned about how to set up server and client keyrings for TLS in the server authentication scenario. Last year's title was What Keyring? What Certificates? All I know is TLS doesn't work. You may find the presentation in this link. And then we will have an overview on client authentication process, which includes 2 steps, handshake and ID mapping. Then we will discuss the steps to tackle a certificate-related handshake and ID mapping problem in TLS in the client authentication scenario. Let's have a quick review on server authentication. Let's look at the keyring setup. Certificates must be placed in a keyring before it can be used by an application to perform identification and validation. Both the server and the client need to have its own keyring. The server admin will need to set up a keyring with the whole chain. The example I use a chain of 2. That means the server keyring contains the server certificate and the issuer's certificate. Since this is an example of a chain of 2, The issuer CA certificate is also the root CA. And the server needs to send the root CA certificate to the client side. Remember, the certificate to be sent to the client side is the root CA, not the server certificate itself. Then the client admin also need to set up a keyring with the server's root CA certificate. Notice that since I'm using a chain of 2, the server keyring only contains 2 certificates, the server and the CA that signs the server cert. If I use an example of 3, then you will see the server keyring will contain 3 certificates. For the example, for a keyring of 10, the server keyring will contain 10 certificates. But no matter how many certificates are in the server keyring, whether it is a chain of 2 or a chain of 3 or a chain of 10, the certificate need to be in the client keyring is just 1, which is the CA's root certificate. Let's review the steps to tackle. Of course, before we tackle the problem, we have to find out which party is the server, which party is the client. From the server side, there are 6 questions we need to ask ourselves. Number 1, what is the configuration file which includes the keyring information? Number 2, what is the keyring name? Who is the keyring owner? Number 3, does the keyring contain all the needed certificates? Number 4, which one is the server certificate? Who owns it? Is its usage personal? Is it marked as default in the keyring? Number 5, does the server certificate have a private key associated with it? And is its status trust? Number 6, what ID will be using the keyring? Does the ID have access to the private key? Similar questions from the client side. Number 1, what is the configuration file which includes the keyring information? Number 2, what is the keyring name? Who is the keyring owner? Number 3, are the certificates cert auth certificates? That means, are they under CA? Number 4, which one is the root CA certificate of the server? Is its status trust? Number 5, what ID will be using the keyring? Does it have access to the keyring? Hopefully, the review can refresh your memory on server authentication. After server authentication, we come to client authentication. Client authentication is an inseparable step following server authentication. In other words, you cannot have client authentication by itself without server authentication. And it is the server side to determine if client authentication is required. Based on the server authentication setup we discussed in the previous slides, here are some extra steps. This time, we start with the client side first. The client admin needs to connect 2 more certs in its keyring. Again, I use a chain of 2 for the client cert also, which means the client keyring will now have the client cert and the CA that sign the client cert. Since I use the example of a chain of 2 for the client, the issuer CA of the client is also the root CA of the client. Then after its own keyring setup, the client administrator needs to send 2 certificates to the server side, which are the client certificates and the issuer CA. I recommend to use a package, a PKCS7 package, to send the client cert and the client CA cert, because using this package, it can help the server admin to determine the right CA to use in the server keyring. When the server admin receives this package, he needs to do 2 things. The first thing is to connect the client CA certificate, which is also the root to the server keyring, and also the server admin need to add the client certificate to regf. This certificate does not need to put in the server's keyring. It only needs to add to regf. And the owner of this client certificate will be used to map to the certificate when the client authentication process happens. After the handshake, it will be used for the ID mapping steps. What happens in client authentication? There are 2 processes. The first process, I called it handshake process part 2. Server authentication ends after the client validates the server certificate with the server's root CA in the client's keyring. Then, the client sends the client certificate to the server for the server to validate with the client's root CA in the server's keyring. That finished the handshake process part 2. A mapping process continues after the handshake process. regf uses the client certificate to map to an ID that owns the certificate in the regf database. Now we will discuss how to tackle client authentication problems from a certificate perspective. First, we will concentrate on the handshake process part 2. We start with the steps to tackle from the client side first. You can see a list of questions is very similar to the server side checking when we do server authentication. That is, number 1, make sure the client keyring already set up correctly for server authentication, which you can refer to last year's presentation. Number 2, does the keyring contain all the needed certificates for client authentication? Number 3, which one is the client certificate? Who owns it? Is the usage personal? Is it marked as default? Number 4, does the client certificate have a private key associated with it? Number 5, do the client certificate and all its issuers have trust status? Number 6, does the ID used to access the keyring have access to the client's private key? Remember, access to a keyring means access to certificates in the keyring. but not the access to their private key. With client authentication, private key is involved. Unlike the server authentication, no private key is involved in the client's keyring. So the access level to the keyring done for server authentication step may need to be changed from read to update if the access ID is not the client's owner. Also, if the access control is throughout data life, make sure it is refreshed. Let's use an example to illustrate those steps. So from the client side, first of all, we want to find out the configuration that specify the keyring. In the example I use, it is called profile.tcp/ip.client, and the keyring is xxclient/xxclient ring. Then we can use the reqd list ring command to find out the contents in this keyring. So we find out the keyring belongs to xxclient. It contains the server root CA. And also we find out we have the xxclient cert, we have the xxclient intermediate CA, and we have the xxclient root CA. So the whole chain of the client cert is there. And the xxclient cert is connected with usage, personal, and also it is marked as default. From the list ring output, we find out the labels of the certificates in the keyring. The label of the client cert is called xxclient cert. We can make use of that information to perform a list chain on that xxclient cert to find out more information. Like we find out that the private key, it has the private key, it has the trust status, and the intermediate CA also has the trust status. The root CA has the trust status also. And from the summary information, it tells us the chain is complete, and the chain contains all the certificates in that xxclient/xxclient ring. So everything looks good here. Finally, we need to check the access of the keyring. We do a outlist out data type xxclient.xxclientring.lst, and we try to find out whether xxclient has read access. But if you are not use xxclient but use YY-client to access that xxclient certificate, update is needed. And also you have to make sure whether the outDataLive class is refreshed to take effect. Now we move to the steps to tackle from the server side. We have to make sure, number one, the server keyring is already set up for server authentication. Number two, make sure the client certificate and its issuer certificates are correctly received. Ideally, the client will send a PKCS7 package which contains the cert chain from the client cert to the root. Then you can make use of ready-cert check-cert on the package to ensure the right certs were received. If the client certificate and the issuer CA certificates were sent individually, then the server admin needs additional information from the client admin, like the fingerprint, the serial number, the issuer distinguished name, subject distinguished name, etc., to make sure the right certificates were sent. Otherwise, if they are not in the right chain, you will have problem. Number 3, which one is the root CA of the client? Is the status trust? Number 4, is the client certificate installed in regf under a regular regf ID? And is its status trust? I assume the mapping mechanism is based on the certificate installed in regf. Now let's use an example to illustrate the points we just discussed. We use ready-cert check-cert on the dataset that contains the PKCS7 package that was sent by the client's admin. We find out that there are 3 certificates in this package. The first one is the client certificate. It contains the client subject name, and its issuer is intermediate CA, which you can see that it is in certificate 2 subject name, and the issuer of the intermediate CA has the issuer that appears on the 3rd certificate, which is the root CA. And you can also have a summary information saying that the certificate chain is complete. That means it contains all the certificates from the client certificate to the root certificate. And one thing we have to pay attention is if the certificate in the package is already added in the regf database, you will see the display have extra information. Like, let's use the example. If certificate 3, that means the root certificate, is already in your regf database, you can see that the display of check-cert will look like this. It has digital certificate information for cert auth. It has the label. It has the certificate ID. It has the status. If your certificate is not in regf, you will not see these pieces of information. Now we find out the certificates in that server keyring. We do a ready-cert list ring, and we find out the certificates. There's an extra certificate now for client authentication, which is the client's root CA. And we can use this client root CA label to do the next step. From the list ring output, we find out the label of the client's root CA. And then we can do a list on that label to find out if the client root certificate is trust. And one thing we have to notice is that the label client root CA does not need to be the same as that used in the client system. Although it is the same cert, it can have different label in the same system. Next, we have to find out the client cert that's installed in the RegF database. So we can do a regdcert ID BOP and this BOP certificate and check out whether the status is trust. Notice that the label BOP cert and the cert owner ID BOP do not need to be the same as that used in the client system. In the client system, remember, we called it XX client, but now we call it BOP. And also, no private key is needed in the server system. And also, it is not connected to the server's keyring at all. After finish the handshake process part 2 in the client authentication, we move to another steps that involve in client authentication. I call it ID mapping. In fact, what we have just discussed is just one of the way for ID mapping. That is, RegF finds an ID that owns the same certificate in RegF database as the client's certificate. There is a second way. RegF finds an ID that owns a certificate mapping profile in RegF database, which matches the subject distinguished name or the issuer's distinguished name or both in the client's certificate. And this is called certificate name filtering. The third way is RegF extracts the ID from the client's certificate's host ID mapping extension. The order of operation is as listed above. That is, only if no mapping cert is found, the certificate mapping will be used. Host ID mapping will be used only if no matching certificate nor matching certificate mapping profile is found. Here are the steps to tackle from the server side if certificate mapping is used. Number 1, make sure the server side has received the following information on the client certificate: on subject distinguished name, or issuer distinguished name, or both. Number 2, is there a certificate mapping filter in RegF? Number 3, is the filter trust? Number 4, is the DIGNMap class red-listed and refreshed? Let's use an example to illustrate the points we just discussed for certificate mapping. The client side need to find out what is the SDN and what is the IDN. For example, the SDN in this case is CN equals BOP, OU equals Department C, C equals UK. The IDN is OU equals test group, C equals US. Then we find out whether there is a certificate mapping profile, which is also known as certificate name filter, containing the mapping information above. We can use the output of db unload record type 508, which contains information on the certificate name filter. Then we can use df-sort ICE2 to create a report. You may find entries like the following. And from there, we try to find out the one that map to the SDN and IDN in the first step. So we find a mapping with label Bob map, and the ID on that map is Bob. We use these two pieces of information to do a regdcert list map to check the information. And notice that all these data from all the three sources should match. And we find out whether that mapping is trust from the list map output. Next, we talk about the steps to tackle if the third way host ID mapping is used. From the server side, we need to make sure if it has received the following information: the correct user ID and host name, as shown in the client certificate's host ID mapping extension, and the issuer certificate. Notice that in the case of a certificate chain of 3, the issuer certificate of the client is the intermediate CA, not the root CA. So the issuer certificate needed is the intermediate CA in the example of a chain of 3. The second question is the profile in serve-auth class set up correctly? Number 3, does the ID have read access to the serve-auth profile? Number 4, is the issuer certificate installed in regf and it has high trust status? Let's use an example to illustrate the points we just discussed for host ID mapping. So from the server side, we need to find out from the client the user ID and the host name in the host ID mapping extensions. For example, it is Bob at host 1. Bob is the user ID, host 1 is the host name. Then we have to find out whether the user ID Bob has read access to that serve-auth class profile irr.host.hostname. We can make use of the output of our list serve-auth irr.host.host1, and we find out that the user Bob has read access to that profile. And then we try to use the regdcert list on the intermediate CA to check if the issuer certificate status has high trust. Remember, I'm using a chain of 3 in the example, so the client cert issuer is the intermediate CA, not the root CA. So from that list output, we find out the status is high trust. Notice that this CA cert does not need to connect to any keyring. Here, let's discuss some pros and cons on the 3 ways of ID mapping used in client authentication. The first method is use the client certificate. The pros is it is simpler to set up. You just need to send the client certificate to the server. The cons is the server needs to store the client certificate, and if there are a large number of client certificates, that may be an administrative cost, could be high. The second way, use certificate name filter. The pros is it can map multiple certs to a single ID. This is a preferred option when you have a large number of users that need to be mapped to a single ID, a single group ID. The cons is you need to communicate clearly what's the subject distinguished name, the issuer distinguished name information to the server. And sometimes if you communicate not exact the information, it may cause trouble. And the server needs to set up the mapping profiles. The third way, host ID mapping. Pros is it can help to map one cert to different IDs in different systems. You can use the same cert to map to different systems where the same user may have different IDs in different systems. The cons is you need to communicate the host ID mapping extension information to the server side, and the server needs to install the issuer CA, and the server needs to install the Server Auth profiles. I will give you some useful information related to certificate name filtering and host ID mapping. In the certificate name filter example, I mentioned about a report from ICE2. Here is the sample job using the ICE2 to find out the filters from the DB unload flag file. This sample job is from my colleague, Mark Nelson, who is an ICE2 expert. As you can see from this JCL, the input is the DB unload flag file, which I indicated in pink color. And after you run this report, you will have a report created. And I'm showing you two entries. The first one is the one that we used in the previous example. The user ID is Bob, the label is Bob Map, and you can see the filter is OU equal test group .c equal US, and then have a send sign. The send sign is the separator between the issuer distinguished name filter and the subject distinguished name filter. And in the second example, you don't see the SDN filter. The trailing send sign indicates that you only have the IDN. Nothing follows the send sign in the second filter. And as I said, the filter, you can have either the IDN or the SDN, or you may have both. If you want to use the third way, the host ID mapping extension, of course, you need to have a certificate that has that extension. How can you get a certificate with the host ID mapping extension? You can use ZOS PKI services. And this is the web page showing you how to get that certificate. When you request the certificate, you filled in the value for host ID mapping extensions. And I'm showing you this example with two entries for host ID mapping. Then, after the request has been approved, you will get back a certificate. And you can use this certificate for the client to authenticate into system, because if you look at the host ID mapping extension, it has Bob at host 1 and Robert at host 2. So if the ID is Bob in system 1 and Robert is in system 2, you can use just one certificate. That's all I have for client authentication. I hope you find it useful, and let's find out how much do you remember. Here are some questions to test how much you remember about client authentication you learned in this session. Number 1, client authentication can be set up without server authentication. True or false? Right. The answer is false. I hope all of you will get this right. Otherwise, I will be very disappointed. Number 2, which certificate is needed in the server's keyring specific for client authentication handshake process? The client cert or the client's root CA cert? Correct. It is the client's root CA cert. You don't need to connect the client cert to the keyring, to the server's keyring. Number 3, does the server side need to add the client certificate to the RegF database in client authentication? Yes or no? The answer is it depends. If the matching is based on an existing client certificate which was added in the RegF database, then you need it. This leads to our next questions, number 4. What are the 2 other ways to find an ID corresponds to the client certificate which is being used during handshake? Certificate name filtering and host ID mapping. Number 5, can you create a certificate with host ID mapping extension with RegDcert? The answer is no. You need to use COS PKI services. The last questions. All the steps that we discussed are checked okay. Everything looks okay. But I still have the problem. What may be a possible cause? Try to think about it and put it down on a piece of paper. I have a suggestion. Mine is the application has not been refreshed to pick up the keyring changes. You may have other answers. We can discuss when we have time later. Here are some references, the manuals, the RFCs. And we have some videos, short videos on certificates. There are a number of hot topics about certificates and RegDcert. These are two PKI Red books. The one said quick setup for multiple CAs, although it is based on release 2.2, but for the host ID mapping setup, it is the same. Okay. You hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So let's have a discussion for any question you have.
So why, I think you've got one question in the chat.
Okay.
And this is from Alexi. He says, why do we need to send the client cert to the server? Should it not be enough to have the CA that signed the client cert on the server end?
Okay, so that is the point or client authentication. So I said there are two processes, right? One is the handshake process, and in the handshake process, you only need the root CA to do the work. But after the handshake process, I said there's a second step, which I called it a ID mapping. So we use the certificate passed in for the handshake and try to find that certificate in your RegF database. If that is the three of the ways that
Hello, everyone. Many of you may know, some of you may not have paid attention. Yesterday at 5 p.m. US time, Kyndryl became an independent company.
Oh, you've got some background music going on.
Sorry.
It really represents a major milestone
I don't
in
know
IBM's evolutionary journey.
Okay,
A journey around technology, client value, and on our path to sustainable growth. Today, I want to talk with you about the company we are becoming and what we must do together and will do together to build a...
Yeah, I think it's gone.
Sorry.
Sounds like a news bulletin. Oh dear.
It's nothing confidential. It's fine. All right. So we need the client cert is because of the second part of the client authentication, because you need the client to authenticate to your server. So the bottom line is we need an ID. So you use a certificate to find out an ID in RegF so that you can use it, right? For client authentication, you need the ID to do something in the server system, right? But for server authentication, you don't need the server to perform anything on your client system. That is that's the distinction between the most important distinction between server authentication and client authentication, because client authentication, after you do the handshake, you still need the certificate to do some mapping to find out an ID. Do I answer the question? Is it okay?
Yes, thank you very much. It's clear. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Any more questions?
Feel free to unmute your line, folks. If you'd rather do that, the lines are on. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, we can talk about it, or you want to do it, type your question. That's fine.
You have the queen of certificates here, folks. As Mark Nelson said yesterday.
I like to, there's so many questions about certificates, and I would like to make it clear from if something looks like complicated, it will prevent you from doing the right thing. So all you do is just, okay, something doesn't work. Let me connect this one to the keyring. Oh, it doesn't work. Connect the other one. Connect the other one. So I want you to present a clear concept of what is really needed. Something is not needed. Don't put it in the keyring. So when you have any problem, then it's easier to debug. And I like to sort out the step-by-step, which you can actually follow to find out what's the problem. I find in fact, the very first problem is you are looking at the specific keyring, look at the certificates, but we forget the most important thing. Does your application really using that keyring you thought you are using? That is the starting point. I find many times that is people forget about that. They are thinking that they're using the right keyring. And when I ask, how do you know? And I don't get a very solid answer from that question.
Yeah.
If you don't know which keyring are you using, that's really, it doesn't have the point to look at all the details about the certification by keyring, right? The first thing you have to look at the right place first. And how do you look at the right place is from the application that use the keyring. And from my perspective, I don't know. It's just like we are producing Legos for you to make to build a thing you need to, but I don't know what you are building. So from my point of view, I don't know. And you have to find out from those the products you use to find out how they specify the keyring, how they use the certificates. That's the information. And I encourage you that if you find those documentation on that product is not clear, send a comment to that book and complaining that it's not clear. Very often I find the books that, for example, they talk about cakes, right? Cakes also use certificates, but from the cakes book, and if they don't put the actual how you specify the keyring, what certificate they are using for that cakes transaction, then you don't know. And even they said, oh, look at the record book. It doesn't help because we don't know how you use the keyring. Sometimes some application will use a specific label for the certificates in the keyring. Sometimes they say, no, just use the default. And you can notice that what I have put in my example, I use the default as in the example. So the certificate marked as default is the one that will be used. And I can say that most, not all, most of the application use the default. But if some application, they don't use the default, they rely on a specific label and you mark your certificate as default, it won't help you. All right?
Yeah.
Okay. So for the questions, so how many, all of those 6 questions, how many do you get it right? And for question 6, are there any other reasons you can think of after you follow all the steps and still doesn't work? What is the possible reasons? Feel free to chat. Yeah.
Colin says,
we still have 6 minutes, right?
Yeah. Colin says, question 6, call IBM. That's what I do, Colin.
No, I say reason. What's the possible reason? It's not the possible reaction.
Anybody want to put their answer? I got 4. I got the same as Colin, 4 out of 6. I tried. My excuse is I'm moderating. Okay, Julian got 4.5 out of 6. That's good. Yeah.
4.5?
Question 6, had an issue yesterday, turned out keyring name was case sensitive.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, keyring is case sensitive.
Yeah. Anybody else? You can unmute your line as well. So while we're waiting for any further questions, so you've already uploaded your presentation, haven't you, onto the website, onto the conference website. So you can download it. And Y has actually her presentation, when you open it, will automatically play, from what you just heard. But this session is also recorded as well, so you'll be able to get the recording and see, of course, the commentary as well. And as well as the questions that Y has been answering for you. And thank you, Stephen. 4 out of 6. Good. Well done.
Good.
I feel it's a 4 out of 6 on average for all of us. Yes.
Very good.
Yeah. And thanks, Y. He says, really interesting. I need to learn more about this subject. Me too. I need to learn a lot more about it as well.
Yeah, there's a lot, right? But hopefully with a overview that you get, if you understand the basics, then you know what question to ask. That is very important.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, please submit your feedback, and also what topic about certificate you want us to include that will be very good to prepare for the next conference too, right, Jamie?
Yes, absolutely. I've already got you booked in for part 3. So that's a really good point, folks. So when you do your feedback for Y, so this is session 1AQ, do leave in the comments. You've got free-form text at the bottom of that comment to put what you'd like to see for the the next session. So yeah, like I said, I already booked Y in for November 2022. So what would you like to see? And that goes for any of the other presentations that you've seen as well. This is getting your feedback, and what you'd like to see is we know the right content to put on for folks. So thank you, Alexi, for your feedback. Says thank you. The presentation was very interesting. So thank you for that. And Y,
thank you.
A pleasure having you with us again. Like I said, the queen of certificates. Now you know where she is, and hopefully we'll have you back next year to present. Don't forget.
Hopefully we can have a drink, right?
Oh,
next year.
Been stuck at home too long. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't forget, folks, to donate to, if you want to, that is, to our 2 charities this year. If you go to the conference agendas, the Virgin Money link there, I did have a quick look, and we are now at nearly 60% of our target. So if you haven't donated and you want to, then please help us. They're very good charities. Up next, so we've got a 30-minute break until 5 o'clock. So if you're going to stay with us, our next session on the security stream will be at 5 o'clock, and that's with Al Surratt, and he's going to be talking about banking resiliency for financial services and some new requirements that you will need to be thinking about. So hopefully you can join us for that. There, of course, are other sessions going on in the different streams as well. There's no keynote or anything like that today, by the way, after the last sessions finish from the streams today. So we actually finish at 6 o'clock UK time. So hopefully we'll see you then. If not, have a good evening. And like I said, thank you so much for joining us, and thank all your efforts you put into your session. It was really good.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.